Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings here on Now TV. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I'm filming this on a Saturday morning, a couple of weeks out before it will air. You'll have to excuse the voice, as I shared with my audience on regular YouTube this week. I've had a really bad respiratory infection. It just does not want to go away, and and my voice is very weak. I'm not able to project very much. I'm not able to talk very much without going into coughing spasms. I'm hoping that I can do this full video this morning and do so without breaking up too terribly much. So, with that said, I want to get into the lesson. Now, for the last 3 or 4 weeks, and of course, we're continuing our study of the challenge of Christ. The challenge of Christ was, if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. John chapter 10, verse 37. Now, make no mistake, one of the works that the Father gave the Son was to come in judgment, to come in judgment in the resurrection. I was literally stunned. And again, I'm filming this a couple of weeks before the 30th. By the way, can you believe this year is almost gone? Here it is, December the 30th. By the way, tomorrow's my birthday. I will turn 73 years old. Now, I know that I look really, really young. The more I look in the mirror, the more I know that's not true. But nonetheless, I simply cannot believe that I will turn 73 years old tomorrow. I'm one of those guys that when I was young, I did not believe that I would ever live to be 50, much less 73. That's like, how did that happen? Now, make no mistake, I'm having the time of my life. I really am. I enjoy making these videos and being with you. I enjoy doing my YouTube videos. I thoroughly love publishing books and interacting with people from literally all over the world. But I got to tell you, I'm having a tough time. Now, mind you, I'm having the best time of my life in many ways, but I still cannot believe I'm getting ready to turn 73 years old tomorrow. Okay. It is what it is. Okay. So anyway, looking at the challenge of Christ. Now, what I've been setting before you is that God set the time for the eschatological fulfillment to bring his plan of redemption, his scheme of redemption to its perfection. He brought that scheme of redemption through Israel so that when it was accomplished, salvation could then be offered to include all nations, all kindreds, all tribes, all nations. So this is so wonderful and so significant that we grasp this. God set the appointed time. We've been examining the Greek word kairos, which means divinely designated time. How in the New Testament, over and over and over again, the New Testament writers say they were living in the appointed time. And here's what's critical. They tell us that the Old Testament prophets knew they were not living in the appointed time. They were not living in the time of the end. They were not living when the time was near. But the New Testament writers said they were. And so that completely, totally falsifies the claim by some that, first of all, God doesn't talk in time like we do, because that's nonsense. But number two, we are constantly told, an appeal is made to Psalms 146, that in which God said, I am a God at hand. I'm always at hand. And so we are told the end is always near. The time of the end is always with us. Well, that's as false as anything could possibly be, because the Old Testament writers knew they were not living in the time of the end. So it's simply wrong, especially to quote an Old Testament prophecy in which God says, "Am I not a God at hand?" And to say God is always near. Well, spatially, that's true. Temporally, it's not. There is a stark contrast between the time statements of the Old Testament that said the time is coming in the last days when it finally arrives, etc., and the New Testament writers who said emphatically, explicitly, and repeatedly they were living in the time of the end 2,000 years ago. So, I've been sharing with you how the Old Testament, we've been focused on the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel, although it doesn't use the word kairos very much, it does use it some, but it uses the concept of the appointed time. Daniel chapter 2. 4 kingdoms are given. In the days of the 4th kingdom, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. Okay, that is God designating the appointed time of the end, the days of the 4th empire. Daniel chapter 7, which is where we are now. Once again, a vision of 4 empires. And in the days of that 4th empire, a little horn would work. He would be revealed. He would be manifested. He would persecute the saints, but judgment would be set. The one like unto the Son of Man would come on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and there would be given to him the kingdom, an everlasting kingdom that shall never pass away, that shall never be destroyed. Now, let me make this observation. Liberal scholars and even some former preterists are saying, well, Daniel 2, Daniel 7, predicting the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. It's not talking about the days of Rome, and it's not talking about the coming of Christ. Oh, well, wait. Daniel chapter 7, 13, and 14, that's talking about the ascension. No, it's not. It's talking about the coming of Christ on the clouds of heaven in judgment. Not going before the Father, coming in judgment to destroy the little horn. But they tell us, okay, Daniel chapter 7, 1 to 12 is the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes is identified as the little horn. Then they tell us verse 13 and 14 is an independent prophecy that's just arbitrarily inserted into the text of Daniel chapter 7. And then in verse 15 and 14, we're given the interpretation of the vision of Antiochus Epiphanes. So Daniel 7, 13 and 14 has nothing whatsoever to do with the rest of the context of Daniel chapter 7. Folks, listen to me. Nothing could be more arbitrary. Nothing could be more capricious. Nothing could be more of a violation of the context of Daniel 7 than that view. It just doesn't work. See, here's the problem. Number one, the countdown of the 7 or 4 beasts brings us to the days of Rome. It does not take us to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes without torturing the actual text. Point number 2. Without asserting that Daniel 7, 13, and 14 is a totally independent prophecy unrelated to the rest of the context. And by the way, where would somebody ever get the idea that Daniel 7, 13, and 14 was not related to the rest of the chapter? Where contextually, would anyone ever get the idea that verses 1 to 12 is about one time, one set of events, but that Daniel 7, 13, and 14 God inserted a prophecy that was hundreds and hundreds of years removed and unrelated to verses 1 to 12. Or, for that matter, unrelated to verses 15 and following. Where would you get that idea? It doesn't fit contextually. Furthermore, Daniel 7, 13 and 14, here's the coming of the Son of Man to do what? To receive the kingdom. Now, someone made the observation just recently, well, that's Christ receiving the kingdom, but that cannot be, therefore, his second coming, his coming in judgment, because 1 Corinthians chapter 15 tells us, then comes the end, when he shall deliver the kingdom to the Father. So Daniel 7 is receiving the kingdom. 1 Corinthians 15 is Christ delivering the kingdom. Well, the problem with that view, ladies and gentlemen, is that in 1 Corinthians 15, when it speaks about Christ delivering the kingdom, it is the Greek word paradidomi. Well, paradidomi does not mean surrender. Okay. In the context of 1 Corinthians 15, it has more to do with sharing. For instance, Paul said, moreover, brethren, I have declared unto you the gospel, which I preached unto you, which you have believed, which you've also obeyed, the gospel which I delivered unto you. Paradidomi. Okay, well, ask yourself the question. When Paul preached the gospel to the Corinthians, did he surrender his authority over the gospel? Absolutely not. Because when the Corinthians were being guilty of sin, Paul exerted his apostolic authority over them. He didn't surrender anything. What did he do when he preached the gospel? When he delivered the gospel to the Corinthians? Oh, he shared it. And in Revelation chapter 22, at the time of the coming of the Lord, for the great white throne judgment, the resurrection, the coming into the new creation, guess what happens? Christ would sit on the throne with the Father, and they would rule forever and forever. So this objection, while I understand it, believe you me, this objection actually falls in the light of a proper linguistic understanding of deliver and what Revelation chapter 22 says. And by the way, it also fails to consider that in every single prophecy of the coming of Christ and his relationship to the kingdom after that, at his coming, he takes the kingdom. For instance, he marries the church and brings her to himself. Matthew 25, 1-13. At his coming in judgment, he sits on the throne of his glory. As William Bell observed years ago, at his coming, Christ sits on the throne. He does not quit the throne. So in order to make 1 Corinthians chapter 15 say that Christ surrenders the throne at his coming, you have to violate every single other passage that speaks of Christ's relationship with the church, with the kingdom, at his coming. There's something wrong, therefore, something wrong with the idea and with the claim, with the interpretation that says that at his coming, Christ surrenders the kingdom. That violates all of these other texts. Now then, final thought here on Daniel chapter 7, proving that Daniel 7 cannot be just an arbitrary, capricious, independent prophecy inserted into the text. What happens in Daniel 7, 13 and 14? The kingdom is given. In the interpretation of the vision. Let me say that again. An awful lot of interpreters gloss right over this. Daniel 7, 13 and 14 is the vision. Daniel 7, 15 through the end of the chapter is the interpretation of the vision. So what does the vision say? Well, like unto the Son of Man comes, it is given a kingdom. What does the interpretation say? The Ancient of Days comes, destroys the little horn, and the kingdom is given. Are those two different kingdoms? Are those two different occurrences of the victory of God over the enemies? No, it's the same thing. And somebody says, well, wait a minute, Preston. Daniel 7:13-14 is the coming of the one like unto the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven. Daniel 7:15 and following, particularly verse 20 and following, has the Ancient of Days coming. But as I pointed out to you, there's some ancient Greek text, very good ancient Greek text. The old, what is known as the Old Greek of Daniel chapter 7 has Daniel 7:20. I watched in the night vision. Now this is after the appearance of the little horn who persecutes the saints, and he wears them out. I watched in the night vision until the Ancient of Days came. Some of these Greek texts say, until the Son of Man came as the Ancient of Days. The Son of Man came as the Ancient of Days. Well, you see, this agrees perfectly with Matthew 16:27 and 28, in which Jesus said, the Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father. R.T. France, among other scholars, have taken note of the fact that what Jesus was saying here is that the Father had given all judgment to the Son, and the Son would judge in the stead of the Father. Well, that's exactly what John 5:21 and following records Jesus saying. From henceforth the Father judges no one, but has committed all judgment to the Son, that all men would honor him as they honor the Father. The Son can do nothing of himself but what he sees the Father do. So here's Jesus saying, the Father judged, and now I'm going to judge as he did, because he's given me his judgment prerogative and authority. So these ancient Greek texts are based upon a solid biblical doctrine that Christ was going to judge as the Father had judged. He was going to judge in the place of the Father. He was going to judge in the glory of the Father. That's good, solid theology. That's good, solid, true biblical doctrine. Okay, now then, once again, let us look closer at the interpretation of this vision. Now, I find it difficult at times to properly convey how important it is to understand the interpretation. Now, I may not be able to get all the way through this today, almost doubt that I will, but I want you to notice, once again, we have 4 kingdoms being counted down. They began with Belshazzar, the Babylonian kingdom, followed by the Medes and the Persians, followed by the Greeks, followed by the Romans. It would be in the days of Rome that the little horn would persecute the saints. Now, we are told by our dispensational friends that we are still waiting on the appearance of the little horn, the man of sin. Look, how many times have you heard TV evangelists, radio evangelists tell us how many times did Hal Lindsey tell us the man of sin is alive somewhere in Europe today? Well, wait a minute. He said that in the 80s. Okay, here we are 40 years later, and you would think the man of sin would have been revealed by now, wouldn't you? But you see, the trouble with Al Lindsey and all of those like him is they have to ignore the fact that Paul said in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, 5 and following, that the man of sin was already alive back then. He was already being restrained back then, 2,000 years ago. Here's a clue, ladies and gentlemen. You cannot restrain what is not there. You cannot restrain what is not active. So when Paul said the man of sin was already alive, and by the way, he was already sitting in the temple, doesn't that give us a clue about who it was? He sits in the temple of God. No, that's not the church. That's not the Roman Catholic Church. Paul was writing in the present tense about the man of sin already being alive, already being restrained. Well, here's a clue. The Roman Catholic Church was not alive, or not around, not active when Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians, chapter 2 in 51 AD. Sorry, that's not historical. That's not biblical. So the point being that the interpretation of the vision of Daniel 7 says the man of sin was alive, or would be alive, in the days of the Fourth Empire. Paul, who knew Daniel very, very well, who drew on Daniel many, many times, he draws on Daniel in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. He draws on Daniel in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. He draws on Daniel in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Yeah, Paul knew all about Daniel. And when Daniel said that in the days of the Fourth Empire, the little horn would arise, and Paul says he's already here, he's already being restrained, he just has not been fully manifested yet, but was about to be, that ought to be definitive for us. You know what? That really ought to put our hearts and minds at ease, to know that the man of sin is not here today. He's not alive somewhere in Europe today. He was alive 2,000 years ago. Just like John said, 1 John chapter 2, verse 18, little children, it is the last hour. I wonder what last hour he had in mind, ladies and gentlemen. Now, if he was thinking into the physical cosmos, if he was thinking the time of the physical resurrection of physical bodies coming out of the grave, then he was pretty obviously wrong. But he was emphatic. Little children, it's the last hour. And I have to tell you, I just laugh. I literally laugh at people who tell us, well, the last hour, that's the Christian age. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. How desperate can people be? John said, as you have heard that Antichrist should come, even now there are many Antichrists, thereby listen to this, thereby it's the last hour. So here's the way that we know we're in the Christian age. Because there are Antichrists present. That's the way we know the Christian age is here? Argumentum ad desperatum exemplified. By the way, what was the last hour? The last hour is the hour of the resurrection. John chapter 5, 28 and 29. So when John emphatically said that the last hour had arrived, he was saying the time for the resurrection had arrived. You really have to be desperate. You really have to be grasping at straws to deny this. So, here's Daniel predicting that in the days of the Roman Empire, the little horn would arise, persecute the saints. And by the way, if we pay attention to 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, and the fact that the little horn, the man of sin, sits in the temple of God, what was the man who sat in the temple of God commanding the Jews to do? Oh, to persecute the saints. Paul said it's a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those who are, present tense, troubling you. Who was it that was troubling the Thessalonians? Who was it that was persecuting the Thessalonians? Go back to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, 14 to 16. Go to Acts chapter 17 and read there. It was the Jews. You see how all this fits together? The little horn would arise in the days of the Fourth Empire, persecute the saints. Paul's living in the days of the Fourth Empire, intimately familiar with Daniel, and says that the little horn was sitting, the man of sin was sitting in the temple of God, and that means that the temple was the source of the persecution against the saints in the first century, the days of Rome. Now watch this. Not only was the little horn to be in the days of that Fourth Empire, thus eliminating our present day from being the time of the little horn or the man of sin, I was watching in the night vision how the little horn, Daniel said, was persecuting the saints, wearing them out. And he said, I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them until the Ancient of Days came. Remember what we just said? And a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. You see, the Son of Man in verses 13 and 14 is representative of the saints. It's a corporate identity. Now, wait a minute, ladies and gentlemen. You've got to catch this. What was going to happen in the days of the Fourth Empire? Little horn persecuting the saints. But what would happen? The Ancient of Days, or the Son of Man coming as the Ancient of Days, would come in the judgment of the little horn. Now, wait a minute. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, the little horn, or the man of sin, is destroyed at the parousia of Christ. You know, the second coming of Christ. Folks, you catch the power of this? Throughout his ministry, and let me read to you this quote from Andreas Stutz again that I read a couple of weeks ago. Jesus adapted the term, the Son of Man, in a very balanced way, 16 times relating to his earthly ministry, 27 times referring to his suffering, 26 times to his glorification. While Jesus applied the term Son of Man from Daniel 7, 13 and 14 to the various states of his ministry, he applied the vision reported in Daniel 7, 13 and 14, along with Zechariah 12:10, exclusively and unambiguously to his return, to his parousia. Ladies and gentlemen, Daniel 7 proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the second coming of Christ, the appointed time for the second coming of Christ, was in the first century in the days of Rome. I'm out of time. See you next week.